we've done the status quo. We've done some great entrepreneurial solutions to business. Now we're looking at the future. Where are we headed? And are we prepared for what's to come? A passionate entrepreneur, a speaker who helps people around the globe be better prepared for the future. This guy runs a much-loved social enterprise called Suits and Sneakers. I wonder what he's going to wear this afternoon. He's currently working on a new type of education system that young people can use at no cost because he believes that everyone deserves a shot at being somebody. Talking to us about the impact of blockchain technologies, please welcome Mark Sham.
Thank you.
Sneaker.
Thank you so much. I know you can do better than that, so I'd like to repeat that, please. So, I want to do a very millennial thing and take a picture, a selfie with you. Is that cool? Are we game? But are you going to stand and make something of it? I'm being dead serious. Come on. Come on. There we go. 1, 2. Like you mean it. 3. Okay, I'm glad. I just wanted to get, I know after breaks you need a little bit of love. So I want to tell you a little story. It's quite interesting because I don't usually talk about the blockchain. I love it. A year ago, for all my sins, I wrote an article as an amateur. I wrote an article about how I believed the blockchain would change our lives, and I was writing it from a very civilian type perspective, and it went viral, as some of these things tend to do. I got about 100,000 people read it, and suddenly I got inundated with requests to do more talks about the blockchain. So I present to you blockchain. So here's the thing. I don't want to get into the technical aspects of blockchain with you today, because I think that I have this fascination with technology, and I think you should too. Not for technology's sake. I think that why you should be fascinated by technology is because it's a means to an end in terms of what it enables human beings to do and what it enables us to achieve. And for that reason, I want to give you, in the most condensed space of time, a little overview around blockchain. If you want to have a yell at me at any point in time throughout the day, please I do not use my social media channels to sell. I use them to offer thought leadership and perspective. So if you want to kind of touch base at any point during the talk, agree with me, disagree, you're welcome. So I want to tell you a little story as to how blockchain connects for me. Is that, I don't know, you all know about Siri on the iPhone, right? Effectively this virtual assistant that you can use to call up stuff. Well, there's a very interesting thing, because Siri wasn't started by Apple. It was actually started by a few co-founders, startups, who about 4 or 5 years before it got bought by Apple, they made this bold prediction. They got a whole bunch of money together and they started working on Siri, but at the time the technology didn't allow Siri to actually exist. But they were basically making this call that in about 3 or 4 years from when they started working on this project called Siri, that the technology would be good enough, and they wanted to actually connect at that intersection of when it was just right, the technology was just ready, and then they felt they would make this play. So think about this. They took an enormous amount of venture capital funding, put it into this thing called Siri. Everybody told them they were nuts. They were making it on the back of this idea that they were going to meet when the technology was ready. It did. They sold to Apple for more money than God has sheep, and everybody wins. What's the moral of the story? I think that in 2018 and beyond, we've got to make a decision. Do we wait for certain technologies to be perfectly ripe and then jump on them? Which technically, if you think about it, makes them old. Or do we start to take a view, technology is just a means to an end to create incredible change, and do we take a view of it's going to be there at this point, so we should take a look? That's what I'm hoping to kind of get you guys to do, so to speak. So that's where my view. So I've got this theory, right, and I just want to give you a little bit of history from Mark Sham's perspective. The world is changing dramatically. Anybody disagree? It's changing faster than ever. If you just look at an enormous amount of change in the last 50 or 100 years, you'd have to say there's no generation preceding it that's ever had to deal with this rate of change. Anybody disagree? Further to this, I've got this theory that anybody who's alive today, and most specifically anybody who's in this room today, you're actually in quite a predicament. We are a unique generation because we have 1 foot each in 2 worlds. If you think about it, you kind of live in this old dormant world, but we're moving toward this brand new exponential future, and you've got 2 feet in either side, 1 foot in either side. Would you agree, disagree? It's quite key to my point, so if at any point you disagree now, it's probably a good time to tell me. So take note, I think this is quite unique. And by the way, if we go back a generation or 2 before us, they were really much living in a linear old world where things were predictable. Things happened like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So at 5, you could look back at 4 to get to where 6 is. You agree? Now it's quite unique. If you were to have a child today, which is normally quite a thing because they take about 9 months to download, you have that child, well, their life, they're going to kind of live much more in the new world. And yet we live with 1 foot in each. So just take that, because that's actually kind of what's making a lot of this thing called disruption, these buzzwords, disruption, innovation, making them murky for us to deal with. But just note, we live in these two worlds at the same time. And then I believe without question that the gaps between generations are increasing. So I've just turned 34 years old. My gran was 34 in 1954. If you were to put our two lives together, even right now, would you say there's anything alike about our lives? But what we do with our time daily, our habits, our behaviors? Nothing. But if we go back 50,000 years ago and we put the life of a grandmom and a granddaughter side by side at the end of both their lives, you'd have to say they lived very similar lives. They both ate the same animals, they used the same stone tools, and they lived in the same place. So there's this gap that's widening. Anybody disagree? So I want to discuss with you why. And this is the crux of my entire talk, because this is and isn't about blockchain. So I have this theory that goes something like this. I believe the rate at which the world is speeding up, the frequency of innovation is increasing in direct correlation to the speed at which human beings share information with each other. Think about this. If we go back 50,000 years ago, I believe that life was local and linear. It was very flat. Things didn't change much because information moved back then at the speed of the campfire. If you weren't within earshot of George, who was 200 kilometers away, and he discovered fire, did you know about it? And if you consider that fire is a technology, or it is an idea that we can build on top of, if you don't know about it, can you build on top of it? So you would have to say, up until recently, that's why life was flat and slow. But you start to look at the way the world has changed over the last 100 years, 500 years, 5,000 years, and you can almost see an uptick in the way the world changed every time human beings created some form of invention that allowed human beings to share information with each other faster. Go with me to the year 1500. Pre the year 1500, to share your knowledge and your ideas and your thoughts was very difficult. If you wanted to do it in the form of a book, you had to physically write every single word of that book just to be able to share your knowledge with someone else. And if you were done with that process, you had to start all over again, writing out each physical word. That's why most people couldn't even read, let alone write. But then we created the printing press, and it did two incredible things. It brought the price at which sharing information with each other down very low compared to where it was. And it created scale. We could get more information out faster than ever before. Do you agree? So now start to think about the world like that. Think back to every time we created some form of technology that enabled us to share information with each other faster. You'll start to see the world sped up a little bit. It developed a little bit faster. Right? You can go all the way from the telegraph to the telephone to fax to all of these things. But here's the game changer, is that in 2018 and beyond, information sharing has become digitized. Why does that matter? Well, this is primarily why I believe we live in two worlds at one time. I want to tell you two things about digital that you need to know. When something moves from an analog state to digital, it stops improving at a rate that we've been familiar with for the beginning of time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Easy. When something digitizes, it starts to improve at 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. If you take the iPhone X or iPhone 10, it's the 10th generation iPhone in 10 years. It's 1,000 times faster than the original. Can you appreciate that? 1,000 times faster than that original just 11 years ago now. So when something digitizes, it brings about a brand new speed at which the way the world changes. And as I was trying to say, most generations before us have never had to deal with that rate of change. The second thing you should know about digital is that when something moves from its analog state to a digital state, not only does it improve exponentially at Moore's law, which is the technical term for it, it also starts to converge with other digital technologies. In English, this iPhone, if we go back, say, 30 years ago, you couldn't just pull out one device. You would have to have had a table full of devices. They would have all been separate. Separate phone, calculator, encyclopedia, record player, map book, torch, camera, right, and we can go on. They were all separate. They were all analog. One by one, they slowly became digitized, started improving at a rate we've never seen before, and they converged on top of each other into this thing we call a phone, ironically the thing we do the least with it. How does this impact information sharing? Well, for the first time in the world, information sharing has become digitized, which means it moves at the speed of the internet, a rate we've never seen before. And there's this thing called zero marginal cost. In other words, how many of you worry about the number of characters you use in a text message or a WhatsApp message? How many of you worry about the number of selfies you take? Here's my point. Whether you take 1 or 10 pictures on your phone, the cost is the same to you. Zero marginal cost is something we've never seen before. So when I wrote this article about the blockchain, it got read 100,000 times, but it didn't cost me 100,000 times more for other people to see it. Incredible, right? So, if you consider that now for the first time, we are building on top of technologies that exist, to build on top of technologies and ideas that exist, and we are moving and sharing information with each other faster than ever before. Would you agree? And it's changed the rate at which the world is developing at. Where does that leave us as human beings? There's two critical things to understand here. One is that human beings are still linear in nature. If you think about the environment that most human beings that have ever lived has evolved in, it looks much more like 50,000 years ago than this little bubble we call the last 100 years. So the software and the hardware that makes up how we make decisions, how we encounter the world, is still linear by nature, but for about the last 50 years we've been dropped into an exponentially changing world. So just to understand, when things get exponential and when they converge on top of each other, we don't naturally deal well with that. But what we've seen, at least in the last 10 years, is that there is enormous opportunity and enormous growth for change if people are willing to retrain their brains to understand how this new world works. Enormous opportunity. In fact, I have to point out that even though this is about blockchain, this isn't. This is about, you've got a decision today. You are either an architect of this future because you are willing to understand and move with the way the world is moving, or you will become a victim of it. There's no middle ground. So, do you remember the year 1996? That was the year my dad came to me and he told me about this thing called the internet. The what? And then he tried to explain in a very bumbling voice how it worked. It was hyper confused. I said, okay, so what is the internet? Well, you do this thing and the modem made a very funny noise and oftentimes we couldn't get a connection. And he was like, I said, oh, okay, he was mad about it. The internet, man. And I was like, I was 12. I was like, well, okay, cool. So what about the internet? He said, no, you've got to understand. This is like another world. You can go on and see stuff that other people have created. It just didn't make sense to most people. But now think back from 1996 to 2018. Can you pick a single space in the world that hasn't been deeply impacted by the internet? Every part of the world has changed because of this ability that human beings can share information with each other at the speed of light. Would you agree? And had you not taken this thing seriously back then, and if you still don't take it seriously, you're just not understanding the way the world is developing. So the internet, can we safely agree, the internet changed the world forever. I mean, it's imperceptible what it was like before and post the internet. Okay, so my argument is this. It's 1996 again, and there's this thing called the blockchain. And people are like, but what is it? And how does it work? And they're bumbling through. And by the way, 1996 internet compared to 2018, far cry. It was clunky, it was horrible, it was slow, but it wasn't about what it was then. It was about what it would enable over time. Can you understand that? Okay, so it's 1990, I'm actually slightly older than this, it's the oldest pick I could get, so I'm about 13 there. It's 1996 again, and there's this thing called the blockchain, and everybody's scrambling to try to understand it. Some aren't, some don't give a shit. But I want to just use a little bit of time to explain to you why. So, I'm going to get technical for you too, just for a second. I'm going to read it with you. What is a blockchain? The technical side is this. A blockchain is a type of distributed, I'm going to shout these words out when they really matter. A blockchain is a type of distributed ledger or decentralized database that continuously keeps updated digital record of who owns what. rather than having a central administrator, like a traditional database, think banks, governments, and accountants, a distributed ledger has a network of replicated databases, synchronized via the internet and visible to anyone within its network. What does that mean in English? I'll tell you. But before I get there, I want to tell you a little bit about how the internet works very technically. No, I'm not. No one gives a shit. Here's why. You don't, let me tell you, if you went to go through all those details there, hyper confusing. What you know is you open your phone, you write a message to someone, they get it on the other end. Does it matter any else how it works to you? No. And you don't need to. It's like, in fact, for the matter, do you know how electricity works in its depth? No, I know that when I plug my socket, it works. I've got a whole bunch of stuff that I can do on top of that. And because of electricity, which is a technology, I've now enabled a whole bunch of other technologies to build on top of it. If we didn't have electricity, a day like today just wouldn't be possible. Agreed? It's just the fact that we can build on top of each other's technologies. So, the two key things you have to understand about the blockchain is this. Because it is decentralized. And what they mean by that is, imagine the difference between centralized and decentralized. So we all understand a bank. A bank is quite simple by nature. You have a bank account, and right now all of us have some form of balance. I'd prefer mine to be slightly different to what it is at this point in time. But the way it's determined, actually, is that some system at the bank says that's what I have. I mean, if someone just happened to change my amount at the bank and say I either had minus 50,000 Rand or R1,000,000, isn't that the amount that I have? It's decided almost, I mean, it doesn't work this way in practically, but technically, someone in the middle, that middleman can decide, it's centralized. One person can say, listen, you actually have minus 50,000. Maybe they'll get caught later, whatever it is, but they can make that decision. If you think about title deeds, right, how do you know that you own your house? People say, well, this piece of paper that I have, or this electronic receipt says that I have it. Well, who says it? Right, the title deed office says it. And if at any point in time, every part of the title deed office system gets washed away, etc., then who owns it? And suddenly we don't know. Now, just imagine, that's what we call centralized databases. What happens if we took 1 million, 5 million, 100 million computers around the world, and every one of those computers all kept a record of what was in my bank account? And for something to change on that record, at least 51% of the machines online would all have to agree. Meaning for someone to change it or hack it incorrectly, you would have to hack the system, millions of computers, within under 10 minutes because of the technical nature of how this works. We've decentralized the model. And one of the biggest things, without getting technical about that, one of the biggest things that it now does is it creates trust with human beings you've never met before. Because it's absolute, and one of the biggest things about the blockchain is quite simply that once a record is put into the blockchain, it can never be deleted. Why is this important? It's not about the technical aspect. It's about there's a time that's coming that the blockchain will enable what we call trust. Trust not only between people we know, but between people we don't know from anywhere around the world. A democratized version that cuts out the middleman. That's huge. And then what about transparency? These two go hand in hand. There were one of the countries in South America, and don't shoot me if I get it wrong, I think it was Colombia, but don't hold me to it, where they actually tried the blockchain for 2 minutes, right, on a specific part of the title deeds office. But there was so much rife corruption, and it suddenly got cut, that they cut the blockchain so they could go back. Because what was happening is, in a country that's total, authoritarian and totalitarian, they were basically doing this. They were saying, I work in government, I want my chommy to own that house, but it belongs to you. Well, I don't care, I'm going to change it. Now, you come with your piece of paper saying, I own this. I say, no, you don't. This computer record says he owns it. Now, who owns it? It's one of the biggest issues around centralized databases. So trust and transparency is what you're going to get. And when you put that together, what you've got is a case of removing the middleman. Now what happens is the blockchain's got a huge amount of interest because it's technically what empowers the Bitcoin network and all the other cryptocurrencies. But you must understand that Bitcoin is to the blockchain like email is to the internet. Blockchain is the internet in this equation. It's powering the thing to be able to do what it does. And what it's empowering is that it's taking a whole look at things, not just cryptocurrencies. It's taking a whole look at other industries and saying, where is there a middleman where that can be shifted, where things can, be I guess, corruptly changed? And how do we use technology that's absolute to drive trust and transparency at a fraction of the cost? Have any of you ever tried to wire money cross-border? Seriously. Recently. Do you know what percentage it can be taken? Do you know how many loops it's actually going through? We think if you go to Western Union, it just goes, us, Western Union, person on the other side. Not at all. There's about 1 billion moving parts between them. The blockchain democratizes that process and says, instead of charging 10% of your money. I was in London last week and I drew £150. And when I actually worked out what percentage of this was the commission because of exchange rate, then the commission on their side of the bank, then the commission on my side of the bank, it was actually crazy what I got for my money. Now, what happens if the blockchain comes in and says, to hell with that, we'll charge a 0.00001%. We'll just do this across all. Suddenly now money moving between borders from South Africa to India, from India to Zimbabwe, doesn't matter. Doesn't see it. And have we seen this before? Yes, it's called WhatsApp. Do any of you worry when you make an overseas phone call using WhatsApp? It doesn't see those landline connections. Do you understand? It's already kind of there. Now, I want you to take note of this video. For time's sake, I can't play it for you, but I want you to take note. This is the video you want to watch post. It's called How the Blockchain is Changing Money and Business. It's an 18-minute TED Talk. Please, for God's sake, do some homework and go. Check this out. It'll be the best 18 minutes. It's not that now suddenly you have to become a financial expert, a blockchain extraordinaire. It's about skating toward the hockey puck. It's about not waiting for the hockey puck to be passed to you but from your partner to your feet, but knowing it's going to be there at a certain point and I want to skate toward where it's going to be. That's all you're doing. It's about understanding the way the world changed. Because if you can fundamentally understand how the internet started to shift the world, because of the speed and the scale at which we could share information with each other. Now add trust and transparency as an extra layer. And what do you think happens to the world? Here's my point. If you agree with me that the internet was marvelous in what it did, in that it's brought about change that we could never have imagined pre-1996, then I have this point for you. It took 25 years for the internet to get to this point, but the internet didn't have the internet to drive its development. You really can choose today. You can choose to be a victim of this future or an architect of it. I'm not a technical person by any stretch of the imagination. And if you were to pinpoint me as to what the blockchain does and how it works, I'm sitting in your corner. For the last 18 months, I've made it my priority to understand these types of technologies. And we've gathered here together in good company to create change. And what I'm telling you is this, is that for the first time, a human being has these levers of technology that can create enormous change. If you wanted to affect 1 million people 100 years ago, you had to be an emperor of that country. Today you can be on your underpants in a garage. I want you to understand, technology brings about democracy, and technology empowers the person on the other end. The reason you are better for the internet is that when you want to buy a car, you don't have to go to physically be at 6 different dealerships. You can peruse 20 at home from your speed of the couch. And here's the final point of what I want to share with you. Over the last 100 years, we've noted some interesting data points around change. And what we've worked out is this. Anytime a large enough group of people are enabled by technology, we won't go back, despite who it hurts on the other side. So a practical example of this is self-driving cars. It's estimated that in the US, there will be about 3 or 4 million people that will lose their jobs because they fundamentally make money by sitting behind the wheel. And that is horrible. But you know how many people will be enabled through total trust, self-automated, no accidents, the car can't fall asleep behind the wheel, doesn't need to sleep, it doesn't need to pee, it doesn't drink. Are you with me? And when all of them are talking to all of them, and you can put your child in one of these and know he will get to the other side at the other time. Do you know how many people that enables? It doesn't care for the 3 or 4 million people. We've seen this before. In the year 1800, 80% of the world were farmers. What had to happen was they had to retool and rethink and become something new. Try explaining to a farmer in the year 1800 that he was going to become a bank teller. Wouldn't have made sense. Are you going to skate toward the hockey puck? I'm telling you, it's 1996 again, and there's this thing called the blockchain. And at some point, you're going to go, I listened to this weird-looking oak. a few years ago, and he just spoke about this thing, and he piqued my interest, and he was right. This isn't guesswork. This is science, and we're the better for it. So I was asked to come do a talk about how do we use technology like this to create change. And I'm saying when you layer on top of speed and scale of sharing information, trust and transparency, we enter into an entirely different world. So I hope, if for nothing else, that I've at least just piqued your interest. Just being willing to go and look a little bit more. I hope that this video, they told me not to do that. How the blockchain is changing money. Do yourself a favor, 18 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope, if for nothing else, you've been slightly entertained, slightly thought about. 20 minutes is not an easy time to do your thing, but I hope you got some kind of value in this sense. And let's all change the world.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mark. I certainly don't think you look weird at all. I'm just glad you left your garage without, not just in your underpants. Anyway. So, in fact, we had a question. Someone was asking where you get your sneakers from, where we can buy your sneakers, so you can answer that, chat to Mark afterwards. There were a couple of questions as well. I'm going to go back to them for a moment. And in fact, Mark, we've run out of time, so we're not going to answer them. But something worth thinking about, why didn't you use your bitcoins in London? That's a great question.
There always has to be one, eh?
Yeah. Be that guy,
Always have to be that guy.
How's the technology going to impact the banking sector? I think you'd probably get that from the TED Talk. There was an interesting question from Farnes here. Is the crossroad of blockchain not already behind us? I mean, we're already into the token economy. Maybe you want to touch on that for 30 seconds, and then we'll call it that.
Yeah, I'm not the expert, but if you think, don't get caught up on blockchain as in the literal technology. Think about blockchain in the pure sense of trust and transparency. If you can get that, then there will be many iterations. By the way, Bitcoin is version 1 of cryptocurrency. So whether it works or doesn't work is irrelevant. There will be 100 new versions better than the first. Most of you use Facebook. Did you ever use Friendster or MySpace? Don't worry about those. It'll continue to evolve, is the point. Trust and transparency.
Brilliant. Mark, thank you so much. Mark Sham.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, dude. Okay. You can see by the poll, I think everyone agrees blockchain is going to be